It's a real pleasure for me to be here, and in fact, it's a bigger pleasure for me to be back on this stage. I was here last year speaking on a different topic. So my agenda this afternoon is going to be essentially talking about the work that we've been doing in the world of artificial intelligence. This has been a space that I've worked for the last almost 20 years. For the first 19 and a half years, not many people cared about it. But ever since ChatGPT became a thing, it seems that there's enough people who actually care about it. Okay? So I guess this is good timing. I know I have the tough job of keeping you all awake after lunch. I'll try my best doing that. So first and foremost, to get you a sense for what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about two things today. Usually people talk about three things. I'll talk about two things. The first is, what is an AI organization? Okay, so many of you are managers, executives, practitioners, decision makers, leaders. I'm going to talk about what it takes to build an AI organization. The second thing, I'm going to then move towards a different direction from a consumer perspective. I'm going to talk about, is AI necessarily all that bad? There's a lot of fear-mongering about AI. I'm sure you've heard about this. And I want to present to you some evidence that we think is quite compelling, that hopefully will change your mind, that we need to have a lot more of a balanced perspective on this issue. Okay? This is entirely going to be data-driven, based on a scientific research that we've been doing over the last 2 decades. And hopefully that gives you a little bit of much more an optimistic take on this world of AI. Okay? So why I say this is because you open any mainstream media, you open a newspaper, a magazine, a television, right? Pretty much all the headlines about AI are about the idea that we should all be afraid of it, right? You're going to hear talk like AI is discriminatory, it is biased, it is unfair, it's unethical, it's going to take our jobs away. Some of that may be true, but I'm going to paint the other side of the story, which is to say that there is tremendous positive effect that AI is causing on various aspects of our business and society, in particular issues such as mental health, physical health, relationships, work, career, financial literacy, education. Okay? For each of these 7 areas, we actually now have scientific evidence that AI is actually making things better. So not dismissing any of these possibilities, but just saying that we need to have a much more balanced conversation on this. Okay? But before I get to the consumer perspective, let me spend some time walking you through what it takes to build an AI organization. Okay? Let me ask you guys the following question, and raise your hand if you think this is true. How many of you believe that human beings actually know more than we can articulate? Okay? Raise your hand if you think we know more than we can actually articulate. Okay? So many of you raise your hands, and you are right. If you raise your hand, the answer is you're actually right. This is known as Polanyi's paradox. Okay? It doesn't matter what your IQ is, what your education level is, whether it's 50 IQ or 200 IQ, we all have the same limitation, that we know more than we can actually articulate. Okay? This is exactly the reason why there is room for machines to complement human thinking and human actions in ways, because we may have the knowledge, but we're not able to articulate it. But machines don't have that problem. They can actually do what they're asked to do. Okay? So how I got started thinking about this is, most of the last 20 years I've spent working with a variety of companies in different parts of the world. At this point, it's probably close to 50 companies in all 5 continents. And the one question that I've always been intrigued about is, why are some leaders a lot more proactive in adopting the latest breakthrough in innovation technology, and why others are not? Okay? And what I've basically taken away is that all of us human beings, we suffer from 4 limitations. Okay? Number 1, we all have challenges in multidimensional thinking. So, if I give you an example of in mathematics, right? You all remember Pythagoras' theorem. The distance between any 2 points is the square of the hypotenuse, right? A squared plus b squared is c squared in a rectangular triangle. Most of us know that. But if I tell you that Netflix uses the same concept, but instead of 2 points, it uses 3,000 data points, that might be a problem for any single human being to comprehend. Okay? That's an example of multidimensional thinking, because you don't have 2 data points, you have 3,000 data points. Okay? Number 2, problems of tacit knowledge, which is very similar to the Pollyannis paradox, that we actually know more than we can tell. Machines follow rules. They don't have to worry about articulation, so they can just comply whenever they're asked to comply. Number 3, we all have limitations with counterfactual thinking, which means what would the world look like had a certain event not occurred? Okay? A very common issue with, when the world of mobile apps first being brought into place in the technology world, a lot of senior leaders were excited about it. And they started to conflate what we call trends with the adoption of mobile apps. And so, for example, if your sales went up, and you can always have this problem of conflating the fact that sales went up because you adopted mobile apps as opposed to anything else. Okay? And lastly, we have challenges in combinatorial thinking, which means that we can do a great job without a constraint, but the moment you impose constraints, right, maybe a budget, maybe a monetary constraint, maybe a time constraint, right, our resources, once they're constrained, significantly hampers our ability to actually progress in the world when we didn't have constraints. Okay? These 4 challenges are what an AI organization can actually address. And I'm going to make the case that based on the framework we have, we're actually able to do this. Okay? So first of all, and maybe this is now pretty mainstream, and so this doesn't need much motivation, but AI is a general purpose technology. There are many, many examples of GPTs, right? And what you see on the screen is the diversity of the adoption of AI in different industries. Some industries, we see adoption going up to like 60% gains. In other industries, the gains are less than 20%, okay? And so what it means is there is a significant advantage, a significant gap in how much more companies and certain industries can actually gain from extrapolating and adopting AI. Okay? This is just to motivate the fact that we still have a long, long way to go before we can fully harness the value of this technology. Okay? So this is what we call the House of AI. This is based on a forthcoming book that my co-author Ravi Bapna and I have written. It's published by MIT. It's coming out next year. And this book makes the case that if you ever are curious about how to build an AI organization, we believe that this is a good framework to leverage. Okay? So in the bottom, you see something called data engineering, which is basically the idea that there's a ton of data that's out there that's not clean, it's pretty dirty, it's raw, it's not processed, it's unformatted. We should be spending a lot of time on building a solid foundation with data. Before you embark on any modeling journey or anything of that sort, you should really make sure that your foundation of the data is actually as close as possible to perfect, okay? Or maybe at least good enough. So the first pillar is known as the descriptive pillar, and the question there is simply looking at what happened. Okay? So if an organization is about to adopt an AI journey, the question to answer is what happened based on a certain data set that you are tapping into. This, as you can see, requires very basic data science skills. It doesn't require any significant modeling skills. It requires what we call exploratory analysis, descriptive statistics, visualization, if you like dashboards, that sort of thing. Okay? So an example of this, let me give you, is a few times now we have been hired or let's say retained by large shopping malls and department stores and even airports to investigate, can you use consumers' walking trajectory data to identify what they are in the market for? Okay? So here is, for example, an example of a customer. You see the red dot. That customer is in front of the Samsung store. It's a cell phone store, as you all know. From Samsung store, they go to the Google Pixel store downstairs. From Google Pixel store, they go to Huawei store. From Huawei, they go to another, let's say, BlackBerry. I'll be kind. And finally, they come to the Apple store. Okay? So if Apple is trying to figure out what that customer in the white shirt and black slacks is interested in, by knowing that in the immediate preceding 20 minutes, this customer went to 5 competing smartphone manufacturing stores, gives them a pretty good idea the fact that this guy might be interested in an Apple product. Okay? because he just went to Samsung, Google, Huawei, BlackBerry, and Apple. Okay? This is what we call trajectory data, and this is very now easily available from people's smartphones based on Wi-Fi transmission, LTE, and all that. So we've now spent, we've had like several projects, like I said, with large shopping malls, department stores, and even airports, monetizing and mining this kind of information to understand who these customers are. Okay? The second pillar is prediction. Okay? I'm sure many of you have heard of prediction. Prediction has been around for a long time. And the question is different now. With prediction, the question is, what will happen next? Okay? Which is a very different question from the first pillar. The first pillar was what has happened so far. Prediction is looking forward in the future. Now, if you want to make your organization AI-driven based on the second pillar, you need people with expertise in predictive analytics. Okay, which means like forecasting, machine learning, data mining, okay? And most good universities already have courses in them. So the good news is we are in fact slowly and steadily producing a great crop of next generation of employees who have these skills. Okay? But that's an important pillar to tap into. So let me give you an example here from South Korea. We worked with SK Telecom in Seoul and a few other companies as well to show you what predictive analytics looks like. Okay? So this, I'm sure you recognize, this is the city of Seoul divided by the Han River, Gangbuk and Gangnam in the south, right? So here is some anonymized individual. We don't need to know who this individual is. We just need to know their traveling patterns in the city. And both the telecom providers, KT, Korea Telecom, and SKT, right, have information on John Doe's traveling patterns going from home to office and then back from office to home. Okay? So Monday to Thursday, this is what we often do, right? You go to home to office and back. But on Fridays and maybe on some Saturdays, instead of coming back home, we might actually deviate and run some errands or make some social trips or watch a movie theater or go hang out with friends. And so the trajectory now is different. On Friday or Saturday, John Doe's trajectory is he goes to office, but instead of coming back home, he makes a second stop, a third stop, a fourth stop, and finally, he comes back home. Okay? So in addition to SKT and KT, every major telecom provider in the planet is mining this information for predictive analytics because they want to send you the right offer at the right time, at the right place. And having access to your location data over weeks and months and years gives them enormous power to actually do this very, very precisely. Okay? To the point where it's not just about sending you offers on your phone, but it's also customizing billboards in real time to show you highly personalized ads. This is also happening, and all of this is something that we have worked on in different parts of the world. The third pillar is, in my opinion now, we are getting into some really hot stuff, which is causal inference. Okay? So prediction has been around for a long time, and a lot of companies, and I would say many people on the planet can do prediction pretty well. But causal inference, I'd say, is notoriously difficult, but it's also incredibly important. And in the House of AI, in sort of the book that we've written, we have emphasized that the next generation of companies, the one who will win the battle in this decade and maybe the next decade, it's hard to predict beyond a few years in the world of AI. But I'd say comfortably that the battle between 2023 and 2030, the next 5 to 7 years, those companies who invest in people who understand causal inference are going to take that cake. Okay? So what is the question here? The question here is now very different. Okay? It's not what happened, what will happen next. The question is, did X cause Y? Okay? Did you buy the product because I sent you a price promotion? Maybe the answer is no, because you would have bought the product anyway. Okay? So there are many, many examples of causal analytics that are important, but the most important thing to keep in mind is, as organizations, if you don't understand why consumers are responding in a certain way to a certain intervention, you can't scale it up. You can run small pilots, but if you don't understand why people are behaving in a certain way, you won't be able to scale it up, right? And that's why this is important. So what's an example? Now I'll give you an example from healthcare. Okay, so moving away from marketing for a bit. Many of you probably have a wearable device like a Samsung or an Apple or a Jawbone, right? These devices, they track many things about you. Your movement patterns, your steps, your sleeping, your exercise, et cetera, et cetera. Some even can track your nutrition. Okay. So what we wanted to investigate was, is there any evidence that people, when they adopt these wearable devices and maintain that over many months, is there any evidence it improves their health care? Okay? If you're tracking your sleeping, if you're tracking your exercise, if you're tracking your nutrition, are you making changes in your lifestyle which then improves your health care? We wanted to particularly focus on chronic diseases like diabetes, blood pressure, cholesterol, that sort of thing. And what we did is we ran several large randomized controlled treatments, like medical trials. And what we found is that after a 15-month period, after about 1 year and 3 months of constantly monitoring yourself and making changes, chronic disease patients are able to reduce diabetes, cholesterol, blood pressure, and several such symptoms. So that's the good news, that people are in fact able to do that. So this is an example of what I call causal inference. The only way you can actually answer that question, right, is by running an experiment. You can't take historical data and then put a model on it, because that's not going to be causal, that's going to be predictive. So the point being here that as an organization, if you're thinking about building an AI-based organization, you have to be very, very open-minded about the idea of experimentation, okay? Because there are some questions and some decisions that can only be taken and answered if you are amenable to experimentation, all right? And then the last pillar, I would say, is what I call prescriptive. Okay, so now we are essentially, let's say, wrapping up the whole house of AI idea. The question now is also different. The question is, how should we respond? Okay? Now contrast that with the very first question. The first question is, what happened? The second pillar was, what will happen next? The third pillar was, why did it happen? And the last pillar is, what should we now do? Okay, how should we respond? So this requires organizations to have people with expertise in a different set of skill sets, such as optimization. Okay? The reason this is important is because you can only answer this question by understanding how consumers behave when they have constraints. We all have constraints. We have time constraints, we have monetary constraints, we have cognitive constraints, all kinds of constraints, right? So similarly, organizations also have constraints, right? Most organizations, if not all, will say, this is our fixed budget. We can't move beyond that. Maybe 5%, maybe a little bit, but not beyond that. So as a decision maker, you're operating under some constraints, which means you need to have people, who can actually understand optimization. Optimization means essentially working under constraints, okay? So essentially an example of this would be, in marketing, back in the world of marketing and advertising, right? Every executive in this world knows that whenever you're trying to, seek money for launching a promotion, launching a campaign, you have to negotiate with the head of finance, right? The CMO will negotiate with the CFO. And it's always a pretty, I would say, heated negotiation, right? The CMO asks for X dollars, the CFO will give X minus 10. That's just always the rule. So you have to understand in the fact that, in the real world, we all operate under constraints. So what we have done, again, over the last, couple of decades is we've helped many companies work through their optimization constraints in marketing, operations, supply chain, advertising, et cetera. Because most of these constraint-based models have a very similar flavor. We just obviously have to contextualize them. Marketing is different from supply chain, so we have to contextualize them. But what you can see is that it's a combination of being open to experimentation, being open to using historical archival data, and also being open to optimization. Those three things have to come together. Okay? So coming back to, remember I told you about the 4 limitations. All human beings have 4 limitations. Now I'm going to tie back those limitations to this pillar. The first limitation was multidimensional thinking. When I gave the example of Netflix, well, it turns out descriptive analytics is exactly what human beings have limitations on, right? We can't do multidimensional exploration, but machines can do this really well. The second limitation was explicating tacit knowledge, right? What information exists here, but we're not able to articulate, irrespective of education or IQ. Well, that's exactly what predictive algorithms do. They use rule-based system to be able to predict what's going to happen next. Okay? It's hard as human beings for us. Even if you put 100 people together, it's not going to work as well as machines do that. Okay? The third limitation was counterfactual thinking. Okay? So again, the idea of what would the world look like if a certain set of events didn't happen, right? How would you actually navigate? It's very, very difficult, if not impossible, for us to actually think through that. We can maybe wish for it, we can visualize it, but the question here is different. Can you actually assess how consumers would behave in a counterfactual world? Okay, this is where, again, we have, as humans, we have limitations, but machines are really, really good at this stuff. Sometimes in combination with us, sometimes alone, but they're pretty good at this. So this is the third pillar that I'm advocating is important for an AI organization. And the fourth one is prescriptive, and the limitation here is, again, we have limitations in combinatorial thinking. Okay? Whether you put 5 people together, 1 or 100, it'll still not do this job as well as a set of algorithms trained to do this optimization. So the point is, I think we have to recognize that irrespective of the organization, small, medium, or large, and irrespective of the number of people you have, there are some limitations that human beings we're not able to address. Okay? And this is exactly the space that algorithms and machines now have an opportunity to tap into. Okay? They're not taking things away from us, but rather they're complementing us. And I want to emphasize the fact that, complementing human and machine intelligence is a very different story than substituting human intelligence with machine intelligence. Okay? So I'm not advocating substitution. I'm saying there's a complementarity, and this is where, call me an optimist or call me a realist. I do think that we have far more, positive prospects with complementarity than with substitution. Okay, so lastly, if you go up, right, all of this is nice and dandy, but remember, we still have to take care of a few things. What kind of people do you actually have to hire in the top layer? People who can excel in storytelling, taking the insights and applying judgment. And you'll see later on, I'll talk about this. Machines are very good at prediction, but they're not very good at judgment, at least not yet. Human beings are a lot better at judgment, but we're not as good at prediction. And so that's where the complementarity comes in. You see, I mentioned the importance of ethical use of data. That's really, really important. Okay? And then finally, if you actually meet this 4-pillar framework, we do believe that your organization is going to be pretty well set for the next decade, maybe even beyond that. Okay, so remember the second thing I am asked you is, should we be afraid of AI, right? Because there's so much fear-mongering. As you can probably guess by now, I am much more of an optimist, a glass half full kind of individual. I will tell you what I know. What I do know is that AI does make mistakes. Okay, AI is not infallible. Okay, simple example: you will still occasionally get calls from your credit card company for transactions that seem genuine, but they flag as fraudulent. Okay, one time I bought jewelry for my wife in an overseas country in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and I never bought jewelry for her, and so I immediately got a call from my bank saying that we have declined your transaction because we don't think it's you. Even though the amount of the transaction was not very high, it was actually less than the price of a ticket, airline ticket, but still the bank didn't have prior information on my preferences for jewelry shopping, and so it declined it. Okay, that happened in 2017. It's still happening today. So just an example that algorithms make mistakes because they're only as good as the data that you feed in. If you haven't fed the right data, they're only constrained by that. So they're as good or as bad as the data that you put in. Okay? So I will acknowledge that AI is not infallible. It does make mistakes. I will also give you a framework. What are the 5 conditions in which organizations fail with AI? And the flip side of that is if you actually meet all 5 conditions, you will succeed with AI. Okay? So there are 5 things that you need. Number 1, you need data, high quality data. Data can be structured, unstructured, all kinds. You also need a means to monetize it. Okay, so it's not enough to have high quality data. You also need a means to monetize it, which means that you have to be, as an organization, you need to have that culture, that mindset that we are ready to ride this train. Okay, I've seen many large organizations facing internal cultural resistance to adopt AI because they haven't done it in the past, and so they're resistant to doing it in the future. But if you don't change your thinking, if you're stuck with the previous way of thinking, then it's going to be very hard to make that transition and progress. So organization capability means changing the culture and changing the strategy and changing the people at the top maybe, so that when you get fresh blood, they'll actually believe in the things that matter. Okay? Number 4, if you've not invested in technology, which is that house of AI I talked about, the 4 pillars, you can't scale it up. Okay, so the scaling isn't going to be important. It's good and dandy to be learning, but eventually you have to productize that learning and you have to commercialize that because most organizations, let's face it, are for profit, right? We are being evaluated based on our next quarter's performance. We are not being evaluated what will happen 3 years from now. So if I'm a manager, a middle manager, I'm thinking, how do I save my job? Well, by performing well for the next quarter, which means I need to be able to have the ability to scale things up. Okay? So scaling things up is where those 4 pillars we talked about are going to be useful. And lastly, defense, which means essentially compliance. There are privacy issues, there are security issues. Okay? So every organization, it's not enough to just adopt AI, right? You have to make sure that you have invested in compliance. So if organizations don't do these 5 things, they're much more likely to fail. But the good news is, right, none of this is rocket science, right? So you can actually check off these 5 boxes, in which case you're far more likely to succeed. Okay, so the last thing I'll say in the last few minutes is, I mentioned to you that we have been doing this research now for almost a decade on the positive effects that AI is creating on human beings, okay? So I won't go through all of them in the interest of time, but this is all part of the book that is coming out, but I'll mention a few examples, okay? So let's talk about relationships, okay? And it's somewhat facetious when I say AI is helping us find love, but it's also true that 40% of new romantic relationships, at least in the US, are being powered by dating apps, okay? And dating apps are not those old school, filling out questionnaires. It's all based on algorithms that are being trained based on your preferences. Number 2, if you make 2 grammatical mistakes in your online profile in a dating app, your chances of finding a partner go down by 14%. Okay? So imagine a world where the algorithm automatically cleans up and fixes your mistakes. So your chances of finding love goes up 14%. Okay? And last but not the least, it's a reality of today's world that there is a lot of harassment of various kinds on these platforms. And so, it was high time, it was due that some company figured out a way to actually predict when harassment will occur and prevent it. And maybe many of you have heard of Tinder, right? It's a very, very successful dating app. Tinder uses deep learning, not just machine learning, but much more advanced machine learning known as deep learning, to predict when harassment is about to start happening based on content that you posted or interacted with in the past. It could be all kinds of images, text, hate speech. And I actually worked on a large litigation matter for Tinder over a 2-year period, which we eventually won. There was a litigation between Tinder and Match.com. And so during that consulting work, I did learn a lot about how these companies are working. And so honestly, I was very, very impressed by the quality of their investments in machine learning. Okay? Another example with mental health and physical health, I talked about the chronic disease examples where we've used artificial intelligence-induced wearable devices to help people with chronic diseases. In Hungary, right, which I'm sure you all know, it's a country in Eastern Europe, there are many instances now where physicians are not able to detect cancer, but AI can detect cancer. In fact, as of this year, there are 22 positive cases of cancer detected by AI that expert radiologists and even physicians missed. Okay? And there are 40 more cases under review. Most likely they'll also be right. We have now scientific evidence about AI-induced apps dealing with mental health problems like insomnia, anxiety, substance abuse, postpartum depression. And all of these phenomena, we've been able to quantify how much more is our mental health improving when we have access to certain kinds of apps and certain kinds of AI-based technology. So we are just scratching the tip of the iceberg here. With respect to learning and education, as a professor, one of my biggest concerns often is if I see students dropping out of a course. Okay, so I would like all my students who enter day one to carry on through the end of the semester, right? But it's hard. And so now there are technologies that can actually predict based on various parameters which student is likely to drop out from which course or which program or which school, which I think is a pretty nice thing to have. We didn't have that before, but now we can actually do this. You may have heard of the Khan Academy, which is an online tutorial service, right? Anybody above the age of 18 can have a personalized tutor called Khan Migo, okay? And I've seen this. I've seen teenagers use this themselves, and it's pretty remarkable how good that is. If you're an author, something like AI-based large language models can actually reduce or even mitigate and solve the writer's block. Many authors have the writer's block, right? So we're seeing a lot of this happening with respect to work and careers. One stat that really blew me away is that 2/3 of people look for a new job within 91 days of finding a new job. Okay? So job satisfaction is not really that high, and so we are now seeing evidence of algorithms trying to chip at that problem. Okay? Unlike the AI increases discrimination, we actually have scientific evidence that based on certain resume screening algorithms, AI actually reduces discrimination, reduces biases in hiring. We've also seen using large-scale projects that chatbots, AI-induced chatbots, are able to increase our productivity by more than 14%. Okay? So I think there's a lot more I can talk about this, but the last thing I'll say is there's a lot of human-to-human connections that instead of AI taking it away, we are actually seeing evidence of also examples of AI helping and nurturing human-to-human connections. Okay, Nextdoor, Uber, Airbnb, these are all platforms where we're seeing new connections being fostered and old connections being strengthened because of the algorithms. Anytime you can predict a fight breaking out between neighbors, that's a good thing. I don't see a downside with that. Okay? So will AI increase or reduce the role of human beings? Okay? Most of us human beings, we do 4 things, right? We look at the data, we make a prediction, then we take some judgment call, and then we have outcomes. So our theory is that while AI is actually improving the precision of prediction, we can't compete with machines on that, but the value of our judgment skills continues to increase because that's not something machines are really good at. Okay, so machines can excel in prediction, but we are going to be excelling in judgment. And that's not something that they can take away anytime soon. There is talk about explainable AI coming, but I think we are far, far away from that world. So that's not a threat I see coming up. So what is the last thing I'll leave you with? I think I'd say that, number one, the future will belong to those individuals or organizations who actually embrace this man-machine duality. It's not substitution, it's complementarity. Okay? like I presented you a few examples of how this complementarity is manifesting itself in relationships, in mental health, physical health, work, careers, homes, etc. There's going to be a lot more that will come in the next few years. And so I don't think that AI will actually replace managers of all kinds. Far more likely is managers who use AI will replace the managers who don't use AI. Okay? Because I think AI is very, very good at replacing tasks, but not jobs. Okay? For sure, it'll replace some tasks, but I don't think it's going to replace as many jobs as we think it is. More importantly, it's creating many jobs. Like many years back when ATM machines came out, people said bank tellers are going to go out of job. There's no bank teller anymore. Well, 35 years after ATMs came, we still have bank tellers, right? When big data came 10 years back, right, nobody knew there'd be a new profession known as data science, right? Today you have thousands of people, right, hundreds of thousands in fact, being hired in data science. So I think it's our sort of firm belief that AI is going to create many new kinds of jobs. It will take obviously some tasks away. It might change the nature of some job, but it's not going to take it away. So just a quick sell for our book that's coming out next year. Everything I talked about is going to be available in this book that Ravi and I have written. So that's it. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for being here today. And I hope this is of some use to you all. Thank you.